At my twin babies' funeral after they died in their sleep, my wife's mother said, God took them because he knew what kind of father they had. Relatives agreed. My wife stood silent. Then my 4-year-old daughter tugged the pastor's robe and said, Pastor John, should I tell everyone what Grandma put in the baby bottles? The room went silent. You know what they don't teach you in business school? How to stand upright when your world implodes in a chapel full of people who already decided you're guilty. I'm Marcus Hale, and 3 days ago I was just another tech CEO grinding through Series B term sheets and arguing with VCs about our AI-powered legal research platform. Today, I'm staring at 2 impossibly small white caskets while wearing a Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's cars, wondering if expensive fabric makes you look less like a failure when your twins are dead. The venue alone cost 48 grand. 48 fucking $1,000 for a reception to commemorate the lives of 2 babies who never got to see their first birthday. But hey, when you marry into the Blackwell family, optics aren't just important, they're everything. Image is their currency, reputation their most valuable asset. And right now, according to the balance sheet of public opinion, I'm showing up as a massive liability. Verdict Cloud, my baby, my legal tech SaaS startup that builds machine learning tools for litigation teams. None of that innovation matters when you can't even keep your actual babies alive. All those board meetings, all those late nights perfecting our AI algorithms to help lawyers win cases, and I couldn't protect the 2 people who mattered most. The irony tastes like bile in the back of my throat. Rowan and Beck, my twins, gone at 11 months old, supposedly in their sleep, though something about that phrase makes my skin crawl every time I hear it. SIDS, they said. Sudden infant death syndrome. Rare but possible with twins, the EMTs explained with those carefully neutral expressions they perfect for delivering the worst news of your life. But there's rare, and then there's convenient, and I've been around enough corporate restructuring deals to know when timing feels too clean. The chapel is packed tighter than a shareholders meeting during a hostile takeover. Half these people barely knew my sons existed, but death brings out the voyeurs like quarterly earnings reports bring out the analysts. I can feel their eyes on me, cataloging every micro-expression, every twitch of my jaw, building their case about what kind of father lets his children die. Then Marjorie Blackwell stands up. My mother-in-law rises from her front row seat like she's about to deliver the keynote at a medical conference. She's got that boardroom presence that comes from chairing 3 hospital boards and having enough compliance connections to make or break careers in healthcare. The woman knows how to work a room, I'll give her that. She's built her reputation on being a force, one of those euphemisms wealthy people use when they mean terrifying but effective. Friends, she begins, her voice carrying that practiced authority of someone who's never been told no by anyone who mattered. We gather here today not just to mourn, but to understand, to learn from tragedy. She pauses, letting the silence build like she's setting up a closing argument. God took these precious babies because he knew what kind of father they had. The words hit me like a margin call. Direct, brutal, calculated for maximum impact. Heads nod around the chapel. Someone whispers, Amen, with the kind of conviction usually reserved for quarterly profit announcements. I feel the room's energy shift, like equity flowing from my account into hers. She's cornered me in front of everyone who matters in our social and professional circles. Painted me as the negligent CEO too obsessed with board meetings to notice his children dying. My wife Serena, law school graduate, junior associate at one of those white shoe law firms where partnership track requires selling your soul in installments, keeps her eyes glued to the floor. She's perfected that pose from years of litigation training, the neutral expression that gives nothing away. But I know her tells. The way her fingers twist her wedding ring, the slight hunch of her shoulders. She's not defending me. Hell, she's not even looking at me. I feel like a defendant at my own sentencing, standing there while the prosecution builds their case. Every late night at the office becomes evidence of neglect. Every business trip transforms into abandonment. Every moment I spent building Verdict Cloud, securing our series of funding, negotiating with venture capital firms, preparing for our next round, all of it reframed as choosing money over my children. The worst part? Some of it lands. Because I was obsessed with the company. I did take calls during feeding time. I did review acquisition contracts while rocking cribs with my foot. When you're scaling a legal tech startup in a market where everyone's chasing the same AI and machine learning applications, you don't get to clock out at 5 and forget about cap tables and term sheets. But I love those boys. God, I love them with an intensity that scared me sometimes. Rowan with his serious eyes, and the way he'd grab my finger like he was closing a deal. Beck with his ridiculous baby laugh that could cut through any stress from the worst board meeting. They were my equity in something that actually mattered, my portfolio in a future that extended beyond quarterly returns. Pastor Malcolm tries to regain control, clearing his throat like he's calling a meeting to order. But Marjorie's not done. She's built her entire career on knowing when to press an advantage, and she can smell blood in the water. A father too busy with private equity calls and board meetings to understand that babies need more than nannies and expensive cribs, she continues, her voice rising. Too focused on his precious startup to notice when something was wrong. I want to defend myself. Want to explain that I was trying to build something lasting, something that would give my children security and opportunity. That every deal I closed, every investor I courted, every late night I spent debugging our AI algorithms. It was all for them. For their college funds, for their trust accounts, for their future. But grief is a hostile takeover of your ability to speak. That's when Kaya moves. My 6-year-old daughter, who's been standing beside me holding my hand with the kind of grip that suggests she understands more than any kid should have to, suddenly lets go. She walks straight toward the pulpit with the confidence of someone who's made a decision. Consequences be damned. She tugs on Pastor Malcolm's robe, a move that would be adorable in any other context, but feels earth-shaking right now. Pastor Malcolm, she says, her voice carrying in the chapel's acoustics like she's speaking into the best sound system money can buy. Clear, precise, unwavering. Should I tell everyone what Grandma put in the baby bottles? The silence that follows isn't just quiet. It's the kind of vacuum you get when all the air gets sucked out of a room. Like when a board meeting stops mid-sentence because someone just announced an SEC investigation. Like when a deal dies so suddenly you can hear the lawyer's pen stop scratching. Every head turns. Every eye focuses. Even Serena looks up from the floor for the first time since we arrived. Marjorie's face goes through a sequence of expressions that would be fascinating if they weren't so terrifying. Confusion, realization, calculation, panic. It's like watching someone's entire litigation strategy collapse in real time. I stare at my daughter, this tiny person who just dropped what sounds like a bombshell with the casual delivery of someone asking about lunch plans. She's looking up at Pastor Malcolm with complete trust, waiting for his guidance like she's seeking approval for a disclosure that could change everything. The chapel holds its breath. Even the ventilation system seems to pause. Point whatever Kaya knows, whatever she's about to reveal, I can feel it in my bones. This moment is about to rewrite everything. Not just about my son's deaths, but about who's really been playing this game, who's been moving the pieces, and who's been too blind to see the board clearly. My daughter just called checkmate, and I don't even know what game we've been playing. 3 months ago, life had a fucking rhythm to it. Not the chaotic startup grind that most people picture when they think about tech CEOs. This was something smoother, more orchestrated. Like a well-tuned portfolio where every asset plays its part, and the returns keep flowing in predictable cycles. I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m. in our Upper West Side penthouse, which, let me tell you, is the kind of real estate that makes even your worst days look manageable when you're sipping coffee while staring out at Central Park. 23 floors up, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of view that venture capital partners use as their Zoom backgrounds to signal success. We paid a fortune for it, but in Manhattan's residential market, location isn't just an investment. It's a statement about your position in the ecosystem. My Tesla Model S would glide down to Verdict Cloud's offices in Tribeca, where I'd spend my mornings reviewing our legal tech platform's machine learning performance metrics and afternoons in board meetings with investors who spoke fluent cap table optimization. We were building something revolutionary, AI-powered litigation support that could analyze case law faster than a team of Harvard Law graduates pulling all-nighters. Our SaaS model was scaling beautifully, user acquisition costs dropping, while our monthly recurring revenue climbed like tech stocks in a bull market. Evenings were the sweet spot. I'd come home to find Serena spread out on our Italian leather sectional, surrounded by litigation memos and contract analyses, prepping for her partnership track at Whitman, Sterling and Associates. She'd graduated top 10% from Columbia Law, passed the New York bar on her first attempt, and had that rare combination of legal brilliance and political instinct that makes partners rich and clients grateful. Her goal was simple: make partner before 40, build a litigation practice that could rival anyone in the white shoe law firm ecosystem. But the real magic happened after dinner. Rowan and Beck would be finishing their evening bottles, and I'd find myself reviewing Series B term sheets with our board members via video call while rocking one of their cribs with my foot. Multitasking at its finest, discussing equity dilution percentages while watching my son's eyelids get heavy, negotiating with private equity firms about valuation models while Beck made those ridiculous baby sounds that somehow made more sense than most investor pitches. The twins were our miracle after 3 years of fertility treatments, failed IVF rounds, and enough medical bills to fund a small startup. When we finally got pregnant, naturally, because the universe has a twisted sense of humor about timing, Serena and I treated those babies like the most valuable acquisition we'd ever made. Premium everything, organic formula, top-tier pediatrician, baby monitors with more sensors than our office security system. That's when Marjorie made her entrance into our carefully balanced operation. "I'd like to help," she announced one Tuesday morning, standing in our kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd just been elected to another hospital board. Marjorie Blackwell didn't ask, she informed. She had this way of presenting her intentions like they were already approved resolutions, signed contracts that just needed implementation. Her offer came with credentials that were hard to argue with. She'd chaired the pediatric board at Mount Sinai for 8 years, maintained connections with every major pharmaceutical company's compliance department, and had enough medical industry relationships to get us access to anything we might need. When your mother-in-law talks about standards and proper protocols with the authority of someone who's spent decades in healthcare administration, you listen. Initially, her help looked like organization, the kind of operational efficiency that any CEO would appreciate. She'd arrive with her leather tote bag and that boardroom energy, rearranging our kitchen like she was optimizing a supply chain, moving bottles from one cabinet to another, relabeling everything with her precise handwriting, correcting our feeding schedule to align with what she called best practices. "Executives don't make good parents," she'd say with that sweet tone that somehow managed to feel like a performance review. "They're too used to outsourcing. Babies need consistency, not delegation." She was building a case against me. I could feel it in the way she documented everything, made notes about feeding times and sleep schedules like she was preparing compliance reports. But I ignored the warning signs because, honestly, she was effective. The twins seemed more settled on the days she helped. Their sleep patterns improved. Serena looked less stressed when she came home to find everything organized according to Marjorie's systems. And Kaya adored her grandmother. My 6-year-old daughter would shadow Marjorie around the apartment like a tiny auditor, absorbing every process and procedure. I'd find them in the kitchen, Kaya sketching in her notebook while Marjorie measured formula with pharmaceutical precision. "Babies must learn to sleep through the night," Marjorie would whisper to Kaya, like she was sharing trade secrets. "It's essential for proper development." When I expressed concern about some of Marjorie's methods, the way she insisted on handling all the nighttime feedings on her designated days, the mysterious supplements she claimed were vitamins from her medical connections, Serena would shut down the conversation with lawyer efficiency. "Mom means well, Marcus. She's got more experience with infant care than both of us combined." Maybe instead of questioning her methods, you could appreciate that someone's trying to help us maintain work-life balance. Work-life balance, the holy grail of startup culture, the unicorn that every tech entrepreneur chases but few actually capture. And honestly, Marjorie's involvement did free up time for both of us to focus on our careers. I could take late investor calls without worrying about feeding schedules. Serena could work on her complex litigation cases without constantly checking baby monitors. At Verdict Cloud, things were accelerating. We closed a major acquisition deal, bought out a smaller legal tech company that had developed an innovative contract analysis tool. Their AI algorithms complemented our litigation support platform perfectly, and the merger expanded our addressable market significantly. My equity position was growing on paper, our user base was scaling, and venture capital firms were starting to circle for our Series B round. Every metric pointed toward success. Our machine learning models were processing more legal documents per day than teams of junior associates could handle in weeks. Law firms were integrating our SaaS platform into their workflow systems. Corporate legal departments were signing annual contracts that made our recurring revenue projections look conservative. I should have been paying more attention to what was happening at home. The warning signs were subtle, the kind of operational anomalies that you might catch in a business setting but miss when you're distracted by growth metrics and investor relations. Marjorie's increasing insistence on controlling every aspect of the twins' care. The way she'd hover when Serena or I tried to handle feeding duties on non-designated days. Her mysterious connections to pharmaceutical suppliers who could provide specialized supplements for infant development. But I was focused on building value, creating something lasting for my family's future. Every board meeting, every investor pitch, every late night debugging our AI systems. It all felt like I was constructing a foundation for generational wealth. The kind of exit strategy that would set up trust funds for the kids, secure Serena's partnership track, maybe even buy us a house in the Hamptons where we could host other successful families and their perfectly orchestrated lives. At home, my most valuable assets, my family, were being quietly restructured without my vote. While I was negotiating term sheets and optimizing cap tables, someone else was implementing operational changes that would prove far more devastating than any failed startup or crash stock portfolio. The twins were sleeping better, which should have been a red flag, not a relief. In startup terms, when something that used to be a problem suddenly resolves itself without clear explanation, you audit the hell out of it. You don't just accept improved performance metrics without understanding the underlying changes to your system. But I was too busy celebrating Verdict Cloud's growth trajectory to notice that my sons were being systematically overdosed in their own nursery. Marjorie Blackwell arrived at our penthouse every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 a.m. with the punctuality of a board chair walking into a quarterly shareholders meeting. She carried that oversized leather tote like it contained the most important documents in the world, which, in retrospect, maybe it fucking did. The woman had mastered the art of looking helpful while systematically gaining operational control over every aspect of our household. She'd sweep into our kitchen with the confidence of a CEO, announcing a hostile takeover, rearranging our domestic infrastructure like she was optimizing a supply chain. Except instead of improving efficiency, she was installing herself as the sole administrator of our children's most basic needs. And I was too busy celebrating Verdict Cloud's latest venture capital meetings to notice that someone was executing a corporate raid on my family. "Marcus, darling," she'd say, unpacking her mysterious supplies with surgical precision. "You and Serena work so hard building your careers. Let someone with actual medical expertise handle the children's nutritional compliance." Medical expertise. That was her favorite phrase, like she was presenting credentials to a licensing board. Marjorie had spent decades building relationships with pharmaceutical companies, hospital compliance departments, and medical supply distributors. She name-dropped connections at Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson like other people mentioned their tennis partners. When she claimed she could get anything we needed for the twins' development, she wasn't bluffing about her access to restricted medications. Her approach to childcare felt like watching a private equity firm acquire a small business, systematic, thorough, and designed to eliminate any competing management input. She'd measure formula with the precision of a compliance officer following FDA regulations, speaking in that sweet tone that somehow managed to sound both nurturing and absolutely fucking terrifying. "Babies must learn proper sleep patterns," she'd explain to anyone who'd listen, including Kaya, who had started following her grandmother around like a tiny internal auditor. "Inconsistent schedules lead to developmental problems. We need to ensure optimal rest periods." The way she said optimal made my skin crawl, but I couldn't articulate why. It sounded reasonable. Hell, it sounded exactly like the kind of data-driven approach I used at Verdict Cloud when we were debugging our AI algorithms or optimizing our machine learning models for better litigation outcomes. Kaya became fascinated with Marjorie's processes. She'd sit at the kitchen counter with her sketchpad, documenting everything with the kind of attention to detail that would make any corporate lawyer proud. I'd catch glimpses of her drawings, bottles, measuring cups, pill containers, her grandmother's hands moving through various procedures. Kid was developing an eye for operational workflows. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" I asked one afternoon, glancing over her shoulder while reviewing a Series B term sheet on my laptop. "Grandma's recipes," Kaya said matter-of-factly, like she was describing a board presentation. "She makes special vitamins for Rowan and Beck." Very important measurements. Special vitamins. From her grandmother's pharmaceutical connections. Administered with pharmaceutical precision. But when I mentioned this to Serena during one of our rare moments of actual conversation, she shut down my concerns with the efficiency of a litigator dismissing weak evidence. "Mama's been around infants longer than we've been alive, Marcus. She chaired pediatric boards before we even knew we wanted children. Maybe instead of being paranoid about every little thing, you could appreciate that someone with actual medical training is helping our family maintain some semblance of stability." Stability. The holy grail of work-life balance. The unicorn that every dual-career couple chases while building their respective empires. And I had to admit, Marjorie's involvement did seem to create more predictable routines. The twins were sleeping longer stretches. Serena was less stressed about juggling her litigation caseload with nighttime feedings. I could take investor calls without background noise from crying babies. But something about those longer sleep stretches bothered me in a way I couldn't properly analyze. In the startup world, when performance metrics improve dramatically without clear operational changes, you audit the hell out of the underlying systems. You don't just celebrate better numbers. You figure out what variables shifted and whether the improvements are sustainable. At work, I was applying exactly that kind of scrutiny to every aspect of Verdict Cloud's growth trajectory. We'd just closed a major acquisition, purchased a smaller legal tech startup that had developed innovative AI tools for contract analysis. The deal expanded our addressable market and gave us access to machine learning algorithms that could process complex litigation documents faster than teams of junior associates working around the clock. Our portfolio was growing on paper. My equity position was approaching the kind of valuations that make tech entrepreneurs start thinking about early retirement and philanthropy. Private equity firms were sending their best dealmakers to discuss potential partnerships. Venture capital groups were practically lining up to lead our Series B funding round. I was building generational wealth while my mother-in-law was systematically poisoning my children. The irony would be hilarious if it weren't so devastating. Marjorie had perfected the art of looking indispensable while gaining exclusive access to critical operations. She'd positioned herself as the sole subject matter expert on infant care, the only person qualified to handle the twins' feeding schedules and sleep protocols. Whenever Serena or I tried to take over feeding duties on non-designated days, Marjorie would hover like a compliance officer reviewing unauthorized procedures. "You're both so busy with your careers," she'd say, gently but firmly reclaiming control of the situation. "Why don't you focus on what you do best and let me handle what I do best?" What she did best, apparently, was crushing prescription sedatives into baby formula and calling it vitamins. The twins were her test subjects, and I was too focused on optimizing our corporate strategy to notice that someone was conducting unauthorized medical experiments in my own kitchen. While I was negotiating with board members about equity dilution and reviewing compliance requirements for our SaaS platform, Marjorie was implementing her own version of research and development. Except her R&D involved finding the exact dosage that would make 11-month-old babies sleep through the night permanently. Kaya kept drawing her grandmother's processes, documenting every step like she was creating standard operating procedures for future reference. Those sketches weren't just idle childhood artwork. They were evidence of systematic child abuse, created by a 6-year-old who had better observational skills than their father. One Thursday afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find Marjorie measuring white powder into a plastic cup with the precision of a pharmacist filling a prescription. She looked up at me with that sweet smile that somehow managed to convey both innocence and complete control. "Just preparing their afternoon vitamins," she said, stirring the mixture into 2 bottles with practiced efficiency. "Special supplements from my medical connections. Nothing but the best for our precious boys." I should have asked more questions. Should have demanded to see the labels, research the ingredients, applied the same due diligence standards I used when reviewing acquisition targets or vetting potential investors. But I was distracted by a conference call with our lead venture capital firm, focused on projections and growth metrics and all the exciting ways we were going to scale Verdict Cloud into a billion-dollar legal tech empire. The one asset that mattered, my family, was being quietly restructured according to someone else's hostile business plan, and I was too busy celebrating our latest round of funding to notice the takeover happening in my own home. Within 6 weeks, Rowan and Beck would be dead, and I'd finally understand that some acquisitions aren't about building value. They're about eliminating competition. That Thursday morning started wrong in the kind of subtle way that makes you think the universe is just having an off day, not that your entire world is about to collapse like a startup losing its series of funding overnight. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to silence. Complete, absolute silence that felt different from the usual pre-dawn quiet in our Upper West Side penthouse. No whimpers. No hungry cries. No rustling sounds from the baby monitors that usually provided the soundtrack to our mornings like ambient noise from a trading floor before opening bell. I should have known immediately. Should have felt that gut punch recognition that something was catastrophically wrong. But honestly, my first thought was relief. After months of interrupted sleep cycles that made venture capital roadshows look relaxing, the idea that Rowan and Beck had finally learned to sleep through the night felt like a small victory in the ongoing battle to maintain work-life balance. Serena was already in the shower, probably reviewing litigation strategies in her head while getting ready for another day of building her partnership track at Whitman, Sterling and Associates. She'd been working on a complex corporate compliance case that could make or break her trajectory toward equity partnership, the kind of high-stakes legal work that requires complete focus and zero distractions. I padded down the hallway in my pajamas, phone in hand, already thinking about the board meeting I had scheduled for 9 a.m. We were reviewing our latest machine learning performance metrics and discussing potential private equity partnerships that could accelerate Verdict Cloud's expansion into new legal tech markets. Big day, important day, the kind of day that could determine whether we became just another failed SaaS startup or built something that actually mattered in the litigation support ecosystem. The nursery door was slightly ajar, exactly how we'd left it the night before. Everything looked normal, professionally organized, thanks to Marjorie's systematic approach to childcare logistics. The baby monitors showed 2 small forms in their cribs, positioned exactly as they should be for safe sleep protocols. But they weren't moving. Not the usual tiny movements. The almost imperceptible rise and fall of breathing. The slight shifts that healthy babies make even in deep sleep. Nothing. They were perfectly, unnaturally still. I approached Rowan's crib first, my brain still trying to process what I was seeing through the lens of hopeful denial. Maybe he was just in a really deep sleep cycle. Maybe the monitor angles were playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe this was just another parenting learning curve that nobody bothers to mention in all those books about raising successful children. I touched his forehead. Cold. Not the cool temperature of morning air or the slight chill that comes from sleeping without enough blankets. Cold like marble. Cold like something that hasn't had circulation for hours. Cold like my portfolio during the 2008 financial crisis. Except this wasn't numbers on a screen. This was my son. Beck was the same. 11 months old, perfect in every visible way, but cold and still as an abandoned startup office after a failed acquisition deal. The next few minutes unfolded like a hostile takeover executed in fast forward. I called 911 with shaking hands while Serena rushed in wearing her litigation armor, that perfectly pressed suit she wore when she needed to project absolute competence in high-stakes situations. We performed CPR on bodies too small for our hands, following procedures we'd learned in parenting classes that suddenly felt as useless as business school case studies when real crisis hits. The EMTs arrived with professional efficiency, but their eyes told the story before their mouths could form the words. They worked with the kind of urgent competence that comes from training and experience, but underneath the protocols and procedures, I could see the truth. We were performing due diligence on a deal that was already dead. "How long has it been since you last checked on them?" asked the lead paramedic, a woman whose calm voice made everything feel more surreal. "Around midnight," Serena answered, her lawyer instincts kicking in with precise, factual responses. They were sleeping normally. No signs of distress. No indication of illness. No indication. That phrase would haunt me for months afterward. In business, when assets suddenly lose all value without warning signs, you conduct forensic audits to identify systemic failures. You examine every transaction, every decision point, every variable that might have contributed to catastrophic loss. But standing in that nursery, watching EMTs work on my sons with equipment that looked more sophisticated than our office's tech infrastructure, I couldn't think beyond the immediate horror. My AI-powered brain, trained to analyze complex litigation patterns and identify optimization opportunities, reduced to one repeating loop. They're gone, they're gone, they're gone. The medical examiner arrived like a compliance officer conducting an investigation into operational failures. Professional, thorough, focused on documentation and evidence collection. He examined the scene with the kind of systematic attention I used when evaluating acquisition targets. Except instead of reviewing financial statements and growth projections, he was analyzing the circumstances of my children's deaths. Preliminary assessment suggests SIDS, he explained, using that carefully neutral tone medical professionals perfect for delivering devastating news. Sudden infant death syndrome. Rare, but unfortunately possible with twins. The exact cause can be difficult to determine, but there's no immediate evidence of trauma or obvious environmental factors. SIDS, a medical acronym that essentially means babies die sometimes, and we can't always explain why. Like calling a startup failure market conditions, when the real reasons are usually more complex and more preventable. But I accepted the explanation because what else do? You trust the experts. You defer to superior medical knowledge just like you defer to experienced VCs when they explain why your Series A fell through or why your growth metrics don't support higher valuations. Marjorie arrived without being called. Somehow she'd heard about the emergency through her extensive healthcare network connections. She wrapped herself around Serena with the practiced comfort of someone who'd spent decades in hospital settings, speaking in low, soothing tones about God's will and unexpected tragedies and the mysterious ways that life insurance policies of the soul get paid out. These things happen, she whispered to anyone who'd listen, positioning herself as the family's grief counselor and media spokesperson. Medical science can only explain so much. Sometimes the strongest portfolios still experience catastrophic losses. She started making arrangements with the efficiency of a CFO, closing out a failed quarter. Funeral home selections, ceremony planning, guest list management. All the administrative details that transform personal tragedy into organized public events. Her connections in the medical community ensured expedited paperwork processing and preferred scheduling at premium facilities. I should have been grateful for her operational expertise. Should have appreciated that someone with experience in healthcare administration was handling the logistics while Serena and I processed our grief. But something about her immediate presence, her ready-made solutions, her complete lack of surprise at finding two healthy babies suddenly dead. It felt like watching someone execute a business plan they'd already prepared. The rest of that morning blurred into a series of phone calls and forms and official procedures that felt like onboarding paperwork for a job I never wanted. Calls to our pediatrician, who expressed genuine shock and offered to review the baby's recent medical records for any missed warning signs. Calls to our respective offices, explaining that we'd need extended bereavement leave to handle family emergencies. Calls to our insurance companies, because even grief requires proper documentation and claims processing. By afternoon, our penthouse had transformed into a crisis management center. Flowers arriving from colleagues and clients. Food deliveries from well-meaning friends who understood that bereaved parents need nutrition but probably won't remember to eat. Condolence messages from board members and investors who knew the appropriate corporate responses to personal tragedies. Kaya moved through it all like a small ghost, carrying her sketchpad and observing everything with the kind of systematic attention that reminded me of myself during stressful board meetings. She didn't cry, just documented, like she was creating some kind of record for future reference. That night, after everyone left and the administrative machinery of death had processed our family tragedy into official records, I sat in the nursery staring at two empty cribs and trying to understand how my most valuable assets had suddenly been written off without any warning indicators. It would take 3 more days and a 6-year-old's courage for me to realize that some business plans are designed to eliminate competition, not create value. Pastor Malcolm Avery had officiated enough funerals in his career to recognize when a service was about to go completely off the rails. You could see it in his eyes. That look venture capitalists get when they realize they've invested in a startup that's about to implode spectacularly in front of everyone who matters. He tried to regain control of the situation with the diplomatic skill of a board chair managing a hostile shareholder meeting. But Marjorie Blackwell had already seized the microphone and transformed my son's memorial service into a public execution of my character. Friends and family, she continued, her voice carrying with the authority of someone who'd spent decades chairing hospital boards and medical compliance committees. We must speak honestly about tragedy. We must examine the circumstances that led to this devastating loss. She was building a case against me with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Every pause calculated for maximum impact. Every phrase designed to shift blame from systemic failures to individual negligence. I felt like a CEO being questioned by the SEC about accounting irregularities, except instead of securities violations, I was being accused of fundamental failures in fiduciary duty to my own children. Marcus Hale presents himself as a successful technology entrepreneur, Marjorie said, scanning the chapel like she was addressing a shareholders meeting. But success in artificial intelligence and machine learning doesn't translate to success in parenting. A father too absorbed in board meetings and private equity negotiations to notice when his babies needed help. The congregation murmured agreement like investors validating a hostile takeover bid. I could feel public opinion flowing away from me faster than venture capital funding during a market crash. She was systematically dismantling my reputation using the same strategic communication skills that had made her legendary in healthcare administration circles. Serena sat beside me in her black litigation suit, the one she wore for high-stakes court appearances, but she might as well have been representing the opposing counsel. Her silence wasn't neutral, it was complicit. Every moment she didn't defend me became another piece of evidence supporting Marjorie's narrative about neglectful fathers and misplaced priorities. Private equity calls during feeding time, Marjorie continued, really hitting her stride now. Series B fundraising meetings instead of pediatrician appointments. A man who could optimize AI algorithms for legal research but couldn't optimize his own schedule for infant care. She was using my professional accomplishments as weapons against me, transforming every success at Verdict Cloud into evidence of domestic failure. It was brilliant strategy, actually, the kind of reputation management campaign that public relations firms charge 6 figures to execute. Reframe the narrative. Control the messaging. Position yourself as the victim while systematically destroying your opponent's credibility. The worst part? Some of her accusations landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I had taken investor calls during feeding times. I had prioritized board meetings over family dinners. When you're scaling a legal tech startup in a competitive market where everyone's chasing the same AI applications and machine learning innovations, you don't get the luxury of work-life balance. You get survival mode disguised as strategic growth. But I've been building something lasting for my family. Every late night debugging our litigation support platform, every pitch meeting with venture capital firms, every negotiation over term sheets and equity dilution. It was all supposed to create generational wealth that would secure my children's futures. College trust funds, investment portfolios, the kind of financial foundation that gives kids options instead of limitations. I wanted to stand up and explain that my obsession with Verdict Cloud wasn't about ego or greed. It was about creating something valuable enough to matter. But grief had transformed my usual confidence into something closer to paralysis. When you're used to controlling board meetings and investor presentations, being reduced to a defendant in someone else's public prosecution feels like system failure. That's when Kaya made her move. My 6-year-old daughter had been standing beside me throughout Marjorie's character assassination, holding my hand with the kind of grip that suggested she understood more about power dynamics than most adults in corporate America. But when Marjorie really started hitting her rhetorical stride about failed fatherhood and misplaced priorities, Kaya let go. She walked toward the pulpit with the confidence of someone who'd made a strategic decision and intended to execute it regardless of consequences. No hesitation. No looking back for approval. Pure determination that reminded me of myself during the most critical investor pitches, when everything depends on your ability to present evidence that changes the entire trajectory of the conversation. Pastor Malcolm, she said, tugging on his robe with the casual authority of a shareholder demanding answers during quarterly earnings calls. Should I tell everyone what Grandma put in the baby bottles? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of vacuum you get when a board meeting stops mid-sentence because someone just announced an SEC investigation. Every conversation died. Every head turned. Even the chapel's ventilation system seemed to pause, waiting for whatever revelation was about to reshape everything we thought we knew about this situation. I watched Marjorie's face cycle through expressions faster than stock prices during market volatility. Confusion melted into recognition, which hardened into calculation before dissolving into something that looked suspiciously like panic. It was like watching a CEO realize that their insider trading activities were about to be exposed during a live shareholder webcast. Kaya reached into her small purse and pulled out an iPad, the same device she'd been using to document her grandmother's mysterious processes over the past few months. Her fingers moved across the screen with the efficiency of a compliance officer accessing critical evidence files. Photos began loading. High-resolution images that told a story more devastating than any audit report or forensic accounting investigation. Our kitchen. 2 baby bottles on the granite counter. A pill crusher. A white plastic measuring cup. A prescription bottle with a hospital pharmacy label. Clearly visible text that read Zolpidem tartrate, which even my non-medical brain recognized as a powerful sleep medication never intended for infant use. Another photo showed Marjorie's hands carefully crushing pills into powder, her face focused with the concentration of a pharmacist preparing customized medications. Another image captured her measuring the powder with pharmaceutical precision, adding it to formula with the systematic approach she'd claimed was just vitamin supplementation. The final photo in the sequence showed her shaking the bottles, ensuring complete dissolution of what I now realized wasn't vitamins or nutritional supplements. It was a lethal cocktail designed to make 11-month-old babies sleep permanently. Someone in the chapel gasped. Another person whispered, "Oh my God." A voice from the back called out, "Call the police." But I was focused on Marjorie's reaction. The mask had completely fallen away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath all that medical expertise and grandmotherly concern. She wasn't looking at Kaya with shock or confusion. She was looking at her with the kind of fury you see from CEOs when insider information gets leaked to regulators. Those were mild sedatives. Marjorie snapped, her sweet grandmother persona evaporating like a startup's valuation during due diligence. Babies need proper sleep schedules. Medical professionals understand dosage calculations better than. She caught herself mid-sentence, but the damage was already done. She'd just admitted to drugging infants while trying to justify her actions as medical necessity. Classic corporate crisis management failure. When you're caught red-handed, denial works better than rationalization. The chapel erupted. People were pulling out phones, taking pictures of Kaya's evidence, calling 911. Pastor Malcolm was trying to restore order while simultaneously protecting my daughter from whatever Marjorie might do next. I stared at the photos on Kaya's iPad, finally understanding that while I'd been focused on building a legal tech empire, my mother-in-law had been conducting pharmaceutical experiments on my children using medications that would have required DEA oversight and FDA approval for any legitimate research application. My sons hadn't died from SIDS or mysterious medical complications. They'd been murdered by someone who understood exactly how much sedative it would take to stop 2 small hearts from beating, and who'd been systematically testing dosages until she found the lethal threshold. The funeral reception I dreaded attending had just transformed into a crime scene, and my 6-year-old daughter had just become the key witness in what would undoubtedly be the most important litigation of my life. Detective Aria Morse arrived at the chapel with the kind of professional urgency that transforms civilian chaos into organized crime scene investigation. She moved through the crowd like a venture capitalist cutting through startup pitch meetings, focused, efficient, zeroing in on what actually mattered while filtering out everything else. Two uniformed officers flanked her, establishing perimeter control with the systematic precision of a hostile takeover team securing assets before due diligence begins. My grief-addled brain suddenly snapped into litigation mode. Years of building Verdict Cloud, developing AI-powered legal research tools, and sitting through board meetings with corporate counsel had trained me to think in terms of evidence preservation and procedural compliance. Even while processing the horror of discovering that my mother-in-law had systematically murdered my children, some part of my mind was already strategizing about chain of custody and admissible testimony. "Detective Morse," I said, stepping forward while Kaya clutched her iPad like it contained the most valuable intellectual property in the world, which, legally speaking, it fucking did. "We need to talk about evidence preservation, chain of custody protocols, digital forensics. The device needs to be properly secured." She looked at me with the kind of measured assessment that experienced investigators use when evaluating whether civilians understand the gravity of what they're dealing with. "Mr. Hale, I understand you work in legal technology. That's going to be helpful here. But right now I need you to step back and let us handle the procedural requirements." Step back. After spending months building machine learning algorithms designed to optimize litigation support, after developing AI tools that could process evidence faster than teams of junior associates, I was being asked to step back and let someone else manage the most critical case of my life. But she was right. This wasn't about corporate compliance or SaaS platform optimization. This was about properly documenting what appeared to be premeditated murder disguised as grandmotherly care. "Kaya," Detective Morse said, crouching down to my daughter's eye level with the kind of careful approach you use when handling volatile assets during acquisition negotiations. "I need to ask you some questions about your iPad. Can you tell me how you got these pictures?" My 6-year-old daughter looked at the detective with the composure of someone presenting quarterly results to skeptical board members. "Grandma said I was very good at drawing her recipes. I wanted to show Daddy all the ingredients she used for Rowan and Beck's special vitamins. So I took pictures with my iPad instead of just drawing." Recipes. The word hit me like a failed series of funding announcement. While I'd been assuming Kaya was just documenting random household activities, she'd actually been conducting systematic surveillance of pharmaceutical crime. My daughter had better investigative instincts than most compliance officers. "Mirror the drive immediately," I told Detective Morse, my legal tech background kicking into crisis management mode. "Create multiple verified copies. Issue a litigation hold on our home security cameras. We've got a comprehensive surveillance system that covers the kitchen and nursery areas. The metadata on those photos will establish precise timing, and our home network logs will corroborate digital chain of custody." Detective Morse nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like someone who understands evidence standards. That's exactly what we're going to do. But first, I need to place Marjorie Blackwell under arrest." Marjorie had been standing near the chapel side exit, probably calculating her options like a CEO facing SEC charges trying to determine whether cooperation or litigation would minimize personal exposure. When she heard Detective Morse announce arrest intentions, her hospital board chair composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice losing all pretense of grandmotherly sweetness. "I provided medical care based on decades of pediatric experience. Those children needed proper sleep regulation, and Marcus was too busy with his precious startup to notice their developmental issues." She was still trying to spin the narrative, even while being read her Miranda rights. Classic crisis management failure. When you're caught with smoking gun evidence, deflecting blame only makes you look more guilty. Any decent corporate counsel would have advised immediate silence and attorney consultation. The next 72 hours unfolded like the most intense due diligence process of my professional career, except instead of evaluating acquisition targets or venture capital opportunities, law enforcement was building a murder case against my children's grandmother. At the precinct, I found myself in the strange position of being both victim's family member and technical consultant. Detective Morse had realized that my legal tech expertise could accelerate their evidence processing in ways that traditional investigative methods might miss. "Your AI systems at Verdict Cloud," she said during one of our evidence review sessions. "Can they analyze digital communication patterns for premeditation indicators?" "Absolutely," I said, Pulling up our machine learning interface on my laptop. Our litigation support algorithms can process email threads, search histories, purchase records, any digital footprint that might reveal planning or intent. We use natural language processing to identify suspicious patterns that human reviewers might overlook. It felt surreal, using the same technology I developed for corporate legal cases to investigate my own family tragedy. But Verdict Cloud's AI tools were fucking brilliant at pattern recognition, and Marjorie had left digital breadcrumbs everywhere. Her search history read like a pharmaceutical crime tutorial. Infant sleep medication dosages. How much sedative for babies? Prescription drug interactions with formula. Safe levels versus lethal levels pediatric patients. The timestamps showed systematic research over a 6-week period, culminating in searches for sudden infant death syndrome causes and how to avoid murder charges medical professional. The medical examiner fast-tracked toxicology screens using rush processing that normally required court orders or federal investigation priorities. Results came back within 48 hours instead of the usual 2-week turnaround. Lethal levels of zolpidem tartrate in both children's systems. Concentrations that would have been dangerous for adults, catastrophic for 11-month-old babies. This was an accidental overdose, the medical examiner explained during our evidence review meeting. These levels indicate systematic administration over multiple feeding cycles. Someone with medical knowledge calculated dosages designed to achieve specific outcomes. Premeditated murder. Not grandmother making well-intentioned mistakes with vitamin supplements, but someone with pharmaceutical expertise deliberately escalating sedative concentrations until they achieved permanent sleep. Detective Morse's team executed search warrants on Marjorie's residence and discovered what looked like a private pharmaceutical laboratory. Prescription bottles from multiple sources, many obtained through her hospital board connections and medical industry relationships. Pill crushers, digital scales, measuring equipment precise enough for research applications. A notebook documenting feeding experiments with detailed observations about subject response levels and optimization opportunities. The notebook was the smoking gun that transformed this from suspicious circumstances into clear evidence of premeditated murder. Marjorie had been treating my children like test subjects in some twisted research project, systematically testing sedative levels until she found dosages that would permanently eliminate what she apparently viewed as obstacles to her daughter's career advancement. Look at this entry from 3 weeks before the deaths, Detective Morse said, showing me photocopied pages. Quote, subjects showing improved sleep duration with increased concentrations. Serena reports better work focus. Plan to optimize dosage for maximum effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability. Unquote. Maximum effectiveness. Plausible deniability. She was writing about murdering my children using language that sounded like strategic planning memos from corporate restructuring projects. I called an emergency board meeting at Verdict Cloud from the police station lobby, explaining to our investors that I'd need extended leave to handle what I euphemistically described as critical family legal proceedings. Our lead venture capital partner, Jennifer Walsh from Meridian Ventures, listened to my carefully sanitized explanation and responded with the kind of unconditional support that reminded me why I'd chosen her firm for our series of funding. Family first, Marcus. Always. Verdict Cloud can handle whatever operational adjustments we need to make. You focus on what matters most. What mattered most was making sure that Marjorie Blackwell spent the rest of her life in prison for systematically murdering my sons while positioning herself as a helpful grandmother concerned about proper infant care. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed, partly because of overwhelming evidence and partly because of media attention that made this case a prosecutor's dream scenario. District Attorney's Office assigned their most experienced homicide prosecutor, someone who understood that high-profile cases require flawless execution and zero procedural errors. I spent that first night back in our Upper West Side penthouse staring at empty nursery cribs and trying to process the fact that while I'd been focused on building AI-powered litigation tools, my mother-in-law had been conducting pharmaceutical murder experiments in my own kitchen. The bottle of Macallan 25 that I'd been saving for a successful exit suddenly felt like a monument to misplaced priorities. I'd been planning to celebrate achieving unicorn valuation while my children were being systematically poisoned by someone who understood exactly how much sedative it would take to stop two small hearts from beating. I opened the bottle and poured 2 fingers into a crystal glass, then stood at our floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The city lights blurred through tears I hadn't realized I was crying. I raised the glass toward the skyline, said my son's names out loud, then poured the entire contents down the kitchen sink. Some victories should never happen. Some celebrations become memorials. And some business successes matter so little compared to personal failures that even the best single malt whiskey tastes like regret and ashes. But tomorrow, I'd wake up and help law enforcement build the strongest possible case against someone who'd used medical expertise and pharmaceutical access to commit the most calculated murders I could imagine. My legal tech background would ensure that every piece of digital evidence was properly preserved, analyzed, and presented according to the highest standards of criminal procedure. Marjorie Blackwell had underestimated my professional capabilities almost as badly as I'd underestimated her criminal intentions. That imbalance was about to cost her everything, while giving me the only form of justice available when someone murders your children and tries to frame it as natural causes. Ada Lucia Park charged Marjorie Blackwell with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And let me tell you, watching someone who'd spent decades chairing hospital boards get perp-walked into criminal court felt like witnessing a hostile takeover executed in reverse. Instead of acquiring assets, she was losing everything: reputation, freedom, the carefully constructed image of medical expertise that had given her access to my children. The courtroom looked like the most high-stakes board meeting I'd ever attended, except instead of venture capitalists and private equity partners, we had jurors whose job was deciding whether my mother-in-law deserved life in prison or death row for systematically poisoning my sons. The gallery was packed with media representatives, legal analysts, and medical professionals trying to understand how someone with Marjorie's credentials could commit such calculated infanticide. Defense counsel tried the she-meant-well strategy, positioning Marjorie as a grandmother whose medical experience had led to tragic miscalculations rather than deliberate murder. Classic corporate crisis management, when caught red-handed, claimed good intentions were corrupted by honest mistakes. Their opening arguments sounded like a CEO explaining accounting irregularities to shareholders during earnings calls. Judge Miriam Estes wasn't buying it. She'd handled enough white-collar crime cases to recognize bullshit wrapped in professional credentialing. When defense tried to exclude Kaya's photographic evidence as unreliable child testimony, Judge Estes shut that down faster than a venture capital firm rejecting a Series A pitch with obvious intellectual property violations. The photographs speak for themselves, she ruled. Digital metadata confirms chain of custody. The child's age doesn't invalidate documented evidence of systematic pharmaceutical preparation. Watching my 6-year-old daughter testify was like seeing a junior analyst present quarterly results to a skeptical board, terrifying and impressive simultaneously. Ada Park had arranged for a child advocate to sit beside Kaya, creating a supportive environment that still maintained courtroom procedure and evidentiary standards. Kaya, Ada Park began, her voice gentle but focused. Can you tell the jury about your grandmother's cooking activities? My daughter opened her notebook, the same one she'd used to document what she believed were recipes for baby vitamins. Her handwriting looked like corporate meeting minutes taken by someone too young to understand the implications of what she was recording. Grandma said I was very good at watching her make special vitamins for Rowan and Beck, Kaya testified with the composure of someone delivering compliance reports. She showed me how to measure everything exactly right. She said babies needed perfect amounts or they wouldn't sleep properly. She read dates and times with the precision of financial statements. Tuesday, March 15th, Grandma brought new white powder. Said it was stronger vitamins from her hospital friends. Thursday, March 17th, Grandma used more powder. Said Mommy needed babies to sleep longer so she could work on important law cases. The prosecution's case unfolded like forensic accounting investigation into systematic fraud. Digital evidence from Verdict Cloud's AI analysis of Marjorie's communications. Toxicology reports showing lethal concentrations of prescription sedatives. Expert testimony from pediatric specialists explaining why those drug levels would cause respiratory failure in infants. But the most devastating evidence came from Marjorie's own notebook. Those clinical observations about subject responses and dosage optimization that read like pharmaceutical research conducted without ethics oversight or FDA approval. Ada Park presented each entry like exhibit documentation in securities violation cases. March 20th entry, Park read aloud. Quote, subjects showing decreased movement with current concentrations. Plan to increase dosage for maximum sleep duration. Serena reports improved work performance when children require less nighttime attention. Unquote. The medical examiner explained respiratory suppression with the technical precision I used when describing our AI algorithms to potential investors. These sedative levels would have gradually slowed breathing patterns until cardiac function ceased. Death would have appeared peaceful, consistent with sudden infant death syndrome, unless specifically tested for pharmaceutical presence. Pastor Malcolm testified about what Kaya had said at the funeral, describing how my daughter had approached him with questions about her grandmother's bottle preparation. His testimony carried the moral authority that judges and juries respect, transforming a child's simple question into evidence of systematic deception. Defense tried to paint me as a negligent father whose startup obsession had created household dysfunction requiring Marjorie's intervention. They presented evidence of my late-night investor calls, board meetings during family time, the classic venture capital lifestyle that prioritizes growth metrics over work-life balance. Maybe if Marcus Hale had been less focused on artificial intelligence and more focused on actual parenting, this tragedy could have been prevented, defense counsel argued during closing statements. But Ada Park destroyed that narrative during her rebuttal. The defendant didn't murder these children because their father worked too much. She murdered them because she wanted to control her daughter's career advancement and viewed infant care as obstacles to professional success. This was premeditated elimination of what she considered competitive disadvantages in Serena's partnership track. When I took the stand, I admitted my failures as directly as I present quarterly losses to disappointed shareholders. Yes, I prioritized Verdict Cloud's development. Yes, I'd taken investor calls during feeding times. Yes, I'd been building a legal tech empire while someone with pharmaceutical expertise was systematically murdering my children. My failure was believing that contracts and compliance rules protect families from internal threats. I testified. I treated my mother-in-law like a trusted board member when I should have been conducting due diligence on her actual intentions. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours, faster than most series of funding decisions. When they returned with guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree murder, I felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. More like closing a business deal that nobody wanted to negotiate in the first place. Judge Estes sentenced Marjorie to life without possibility of parole, explaining that someone who used medical expertise to commit premeditated infanticide represented ongoing danger to society. You violated every principle of medical ethics and family trust. You will never again have opportunity to harm children. Marjorie's final statement sounded like a CEO being removed by shareholders for cause. I was trying to help my family achieve work-life balance. Marcus was a brand-obsessed entrepreneur who couldn't prioritize properly. I provided medical solutions to household management problems. Medical solutions. She described murdering my sons like optimizing operational efficiency. The bailiff led her away in shackles, and I realized I'd never look at her again. Some business relationships end with handshakes and non-disclosure agreements. Others end with life sentences and federal prison transport. Grief is a balance sheet with only red ink. No matter how you restructure the assets, no matter how creatively you approach the accounting, the fundamental math doesn't work. You've lost more than you can ever recover. I found myself applying corporate reorganization principles to what remained of my family, trying to optimize for damage control and long-term stability while processing the reality that some losses permanently alter your entire operational framework. 6 months after Marjorie's conviction, I filed for legal separation from Serena. Not divorce, not yet, but the kind of structured arrangement that acknowledges fundamental differences in how partners process catastrophic business failures. We needed space to evaluate our individual liability in this disaster and determine whether our partnership could survive the systematic destruction of everything we'd built together. Serena had enabled her mother's access through willful ignorance and professional ambition. She dismissed my concerns about Marjorie's mysterious pharmaceutical connections because having free childcare meant she could focus on building her litigation practice at Whitman, Sterling and Associates. Her silence during the funeral had been strategic, protecting her own reputation while I got publicly crucified for failures that we both contributed to through different forms of negligence. I couldn't have known what she was doing, Serena insisted during one of our separation mediation sessions, sounding like a CEO denying knowledge of accounting fraud despite obvious red flags. My mother was a respected medical professional with decades of pediatric experience. But that was exactly the problem. Serena had treated her mother like a trusted vendor without conducting proper due diligence on her actual methods or motivations. In corporate terms, she'd outsourced critical operations without maintaining oversight or compliance monitoring. The results were predictable: catastrophic failure with maximum liability exposure. We established joint legal custody of Kaya with structured visitation schedules and strict operational boundaries. No overnight stays at locations where Marjorie's enablers might have access. No childcare providers without comprehensive background checks and verified medical credentials. The kind of protective protocols I should have implemented before allowing anyone unsupervised access to my children. I moved most of our liquid assets into an irrevocable trust fund in Kaya's name, structured with ironclad compliance rules that would prevent any future family members from accessing those resources for personal agendas. Education expenses, therapy costs, charitable contributions, legitimate uses only, with independent trustees who couldn't be influenced by emotional manipulation or family politics. The trust documentation read like a venture capital term sheet designed to prevent founder abuse and protect minority shareholders. Kaya would have access to resources for her development and security, but nobody else could leverage those assets for their own career advancement or personal projects. I'd learned the hard way that family relationships require the same protective structures as business partnerships when significant money is involved. At Verdict Cloud, I took a different approach to restructuring. Instead of stepping back from operations, I doubled down on building something that mattered beyond quarterly revenue targets. We closed our Series B funding round with Meridian Ventures leading a $15 million investment at a $75 million pre-money valuation, terms that positioned us as serious players in the legal tech ecosystem. But instead of using that capital for aggressive market expansion and competitive positioning, I redirected our development resources toward applications that could prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed my family. Our machine learning algorithms were already sophisticated enough to analyze communication patterns for litigation support. With some optimization, they could identify coercive control indicators in family law cases and corporate compliance violations. Jennifer Walsh from Meridian understood the strategic pivot when I explained our new mission alignment during a board meeting at their Midtown offices. Marcus, you're developing technology that addresses real social problems while expanding our total addressable market. Family law represents a massive underserved sector that needs AI-powered evidence analysis. We launched a new feature set called Verdict Guard, machine learning tools that could flag suspicious language in digital communications, identify patterns of escalating control or manipulation, detect pharmaceutical research that might indicate planned harm. The kind of AI applications that might have caught Marjorie's systematic preparation for murdering my children if anyone had been monitoring her digital footprint. Corporate legal departments started integrating Verdict Guard into their compliance frameworks for detecting insider threats and preventing workplace violence. Family law attorneys used our algorithms to analyze custody cases where one parent might be using medical authority or financial control to manipulate outcomes. Child Protective Services agencies adopted our technology to identify high-risk situations before they escalated into tragedy. My investors called it mission-aligned innovation. I called it building something useful from the ashes of personal failure. I resigned from the Pediatric Research Foundation where Marjorie had served as a board member, but not quietly. I coordinated with other major donors to execute what was essentially a proxy campaign that replaced half the board with medical professionals who had never worked with pharmaceutical companies that supplied controlled substances to private individuals. The restructuring wasn't about revenge. It was about preventing future access to the institutional relationships that had enabled Marjorie's crimes. Her hospital board connections and pharmaceutical industry contacts had given her the credibility and resources to commit systematic infanticide while maintaining plausible cover stories about medical expertise. I used private equity principles to fund a new pediatric forensics laboratory at Mount Sinai, endowed in Rowan and Beck's names with a $2 million commitment that would support research into detecting pharmaceutical abuse in infant death cases. The lab would develop testing protocols that could identify systematic poisoning even when traditional SIDS investigations found no obvious cause of death. Dr. Sarah Chun, the forensic pathologist we recruited to direct the facility, explained their research mandate during the dedication ceremony. Too many infant deaths get classified as unexplained when they actually represent systematic abuse by caregivers with medical knowledge. This laboratory will develop the analytical capabilities to identify those patterns and protect vulnerable children. At Verdict Cloud, our employee handbook got updated with extensive family protection policies, comprehensive background checks for anyone providing childcare services to employee families, mental health resources for parents dealing with controlling or manipulative relatives, legal assistance funds for employees facing family court proceedings where someone might be using professional credentials to gain inappropriate access to children. The policies felt excessive until you considered that most workplace violence and corporate sabotage comes from trusted insiders who understand how to exploit institutional vulnerabilities. Family members with professional credentials represent the same kind of insider threat, except the stakes involve children instead of just financial assets. My own relationship with Kaya became the most important restructuring project. She demonstrated more courage and investigative skill than most adults when she documented Marjorie's systematic pharmaceutical abuse. But she was still processing the trauma of losing her brothers and testifying against her grandmother in criminal court. We started weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, a child psychologist who specialized in helping young witnesses recover from family violence cases. Kaya needed professional support to understand that her documentation had been heroic, not disloyal, and that adults should have been protecting her instead of depending on her to expose criminal behavior. She saved other children by being brave enough to tell the truth, Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of our family sessions. But she shouldn't have been put in a position where her courage was necessary for justice. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the same days when Marjorie used to arrive with her leather tote full of pharmaceutical supplies, Kaya and I would have special time together. Sometimes we'd work on her art projects, helping her process difficult emotions through creative expression instead of surveillance documentation. Sometimes we'd review her college savings account, teaching her about responsible financial planning and the difference between building generational wealth and enabling family exploitation. The restructuring of our lives would never fully restore what we'd lost, but it created protective frameworks that might prevent similar tragedies. Not just for our family, but for other children whose parents might be too focused on professional success to notice that trusted relatives were systematically eliminating inconvenient obstacles to career advancement. 18 months after the trial, I found myself standing in front of packed auditoriums at Harvard Law School, Columbia Law, and Yale, delivering keynote speeches that felt like the most important investor pitches of my career, except instead of seeking capital, I was trying to prevent other families from experiencing the systematic destruction that had ended my sons' lives. The audiences were filled with future attorneys, law firm partners, and corporate counsel who needed to understand that legal expertise without moral oversight creates opportunities for sophisticated criminal behavior. You're going to graduate into positions of significant power, I told a room full of third-year law students at Harvard, partners at white shoe firms, general counsel for Fortune 500 companies, federal prosecutors handling complex cases. That power comes with fiduciary duties that extend beyond client representation and shareholder returns. The presentation slides showed Kaya's photographs. The systematic pharmaceutical preparation that had passed for grandmotherly care while someone with medical credentials murdered my children. But I contextualized the evidence within broader frameworks about institutional authority and the responsibility that comes with professional expertise. My mother-in-law used her hospital board connections and pharmaceutical industry relationships to gain access to controlled substances that should never be administered to infants. Her medical credentials gave her credibility that prevented proper scrutiny of her methods. She exploited institutional trust to commit premeditated murder. Law school audiences understood the implications immediately. These were future partners who would chair nonprofit boards, serve on hospital compliance committees, oversee corporate due diligence processes. They needed to recognize that professional credentials can be weaponized by people who understand how to exploit systemic vulnerabilities for personal agendas. Corporate General Counsel were equally receptive when I spoke at American Corporate Counsel Association conferences about detecting internal threats and preventing insider abuse. My presentations focused on applying the same risk assessment frameworks we used in corporate compliance to identify family members or trusted relationships that might pose security risks to executive families. Culture is not a slide deck presentation during quarterly board meetings. I explained to a room full of Fortune 500 legal chiefs. Culture is who gets believed when power speaks. It's whether your organization has systems that can detect systematic abuse by people with institutional authority. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Corporate America had spent decades developing sophisticated frameworks for preventing securities fraud, intellectual property theft, and workplace discrimination. But most companies had never considered that employees' family members might use professional connections to commit crimes that could create liability exposure for the organization. Several major law firms started implementing new policies requiring background checks and psychological evaluations for anyone providing childcare services to partner families. Not because they suspected widespread infanticide, but because systematic abuse by trusted family members represented the kind of reputational risk that could destroy partnerships and undermine client confidence. I also spoke to parent groups and family advocacy organizations, though those audiences required different messaging strategies. Instead of focusing on corporate risk management, I emphasized practical warning signs that might indicate systematic manipulation or control by relatives with professional credentials. Listen to your children, especially when they document things that seem unusual. I told a room full of mothers at an Upper West Side parenting conference. Kaya's drawings and photographs saved other families from experiencing what we went through. Children often see patterns that adults miss because they're not invested in maintaining relationships with people who have social or professional authority. The most powerful presentations happened at family court conferences, where judges, child advocates, and custody evaluators needed to understand how sophisticated abusers might use medical expertise or pharmaceutical access to influence custody outcomes. These were professionals who dealt with manipulation and coercive control every day, but they hadn't necessarily considered how someone might use systematic poisoning as a method of eliminating obstacles to preferred custody arrangements. Judge Patricia Morrison from Manhattan Family Court invited me to present at their annual judicial training conference. We see cases where parents claim medical emergencies or developmental issues to justify restricting visitation or modifying custody arrangements. Your experience helps us understand how those claims might be manufactured through systematic pharmaceutical abuse. Beyond speaking engagements, I was building something more substantial, an investment portfolio focused on companies developing technologies that could prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed my family. Angel investing became my way of using financial resources to support innovative solutions to problems that traditional venture capital markets hadn't prioritized. My first major investment was in SafeFeed Technologies, a startup developing AI-powered feeding monitors that could detect unusual substances in infant formula or breast milk. Their prototype used spectroscopic analysis combined with machine learning algorithms to identify pharmaceutical compounds that shouldn't be present in baby nutrition. Not narcotics detection for law enforcement purposes, pure pattern tracking for parent peace of mind. We're not trying to criminalize family relationships, explained Dr. Amanda Chun, SafeFeed's founder and a former pediatric researcher at Boston Children's Hospital. We're developing tools that give parents real-time information about what their children are consuming, especially when childcare responsibilities are shared with relatives or babysitters who might have their own agendas. I invested $250,000 in their Series A round. not because I expected massive financial returns, but because their technology might prevent other families from discovering pharmaceutical abuse only after children had died from systematic poisoning. My second significant investment was in Legal Guardian, a legal tech startup that automates compliance affidavits for family court proceedings. Their platform used natural language processing to analyze custody documentation for inconsistencies, suspicious medical claims, or patterns that might indicate systematic manipulation by one parent or family member. The company's founder, Maria Santos, had developed their algorithms after her own experience with an ex-husband who had used his psychiatric credentials to manipulate custody evaluators and gain inappropriate access to their children. Her personal motivation aligned perfectly with my investment criteria, people building solutions to problems they understood intimately. Family court judges handle hundreds of cases with limited time to identify sophisticated manipulation, Santos explained during their pitch presentation. Our AI tools can flag potential red flags that human reviewers might miss, especially when someone with professional credentials is systematically lying about medical or psychological issues. I provided both seed funding and strategic advisory support, helping them integrate Verdict Cloud's machine learning capabilities with their family law applications. The synergies were obvious. My legal tech expertise combined with their specialized focus on custody protection created opportunities for comprehensive solutions that neither company could develop independently. Travel became more intentional and less frequent. I'd previously spent significant time on private jets flying to investor meetings and corporate conferences that felt important but rarely produced meaningful impact. Now I limited business travel to speaking engagements and investment due diligence that aligned with protecting families from systematic abuse. The one exception was when I borrowed a friend's private jet to transport Kaya to an intensive therapy program in California and back in a single day. Dr. Elizabeth Harper ran a specialized treatment center for child witnesses who had testified in family violence cases. Kaya needed professional support from someone who understood the unique trauma of documenting abuse by trusted relatives. She saved lives by being brave enough to tell the truth, Dr. Harper explained during our consultation. But she's processing guilt about her brother's deaths and confusion about her grandmother's motivations. Children shouldn't have to choose between loyalty and safety. The therapy intensive helped Kaya understand that her documentation had been heroic, not disloyal, and that adults should have been protecting her instead of depending on her courage to expose criminal behavior. She returned home with better emotional frameworks for processing what had happened and more confidence about her role in preventing similar tragedies. Serena and I slowly learned to communicate without the defensive strategies we developed during our marriage. She apologized for enabling her mother's access without defending Marjorie's actions or minimizing the damage that willful ignorance had caused. I acknowledged my own failures in prioritizing business development over family security. I trusted her because she had medical expertise and I was focused on making partner, Serena admitted during one of our family therapy sessions. I didn't want to conduct due diligence on my own mother's childcare methods because it felt like questioning her professional competence. Forgiveness wasn't a merger that restored our previous relationship structure. It was a slow restructuring process that acknowledged shared responsibility for systematic failures while building new protective frameworks that prioritized our daughter's safety and emotional well-being above all other considerations. The work was difficult, but it was also necessary. We both learned that professional success means nothing if you can't protect the people who matter most from trusted relatives who exploit institutional authority to commit unthinkable crimes. 2 years after the trial that sent Marjorie Blackwell to life imprisonment for systematically murdering my sons, I found myself standing beside 2 small headstones on a gray October morning that felt like the kind of board meeting where everyone knows the company is about to pivot, but nobody wants to acknowledge how fundamentally everything has changed. Kaya held my hand with the steady grip of someone who'd learned that documentation matters more than wishful thinking, and that telling the truth, even when it destroys families, sometimes prevents worse tragedies from happening to other people. The cemetery was quiet except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic, that constant background noise of a city where 8 million people pursue their individual versions of success, while mostly ignoring the systematic failures that destroy families behind closed doors. Central Park stretched out beyond the Memorial Gardens, showing off its autumn portfolio of colors that made even grief look manageable when you had enough money to buy premium views of seasonal transitions. Kaya had brought a folded piece of paper, another one of her documented communications, though this one was addressed to brothers who would never grow up to appreciate her investigative skills or understand how their deaths had transformed our family's entire operational framework. "Can I read it out loud?" she asked, looking up at me with the kind of composed authority she'd developed since testifying in criminal court about pharmaceutical murder disguised as grandmotherly care. "Of course, sweetheart." She unfolded the paper and cleared her throat with the confidence of someone presenting quarterly results to a board that actually listened to her analysis instead of dismissing her observations as childish imagination. "Dear Rowan and Beck," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I still write everything down, just like I did when Grandma was making her special recipes. Daddy says that's how we make sure important things don't get forgotten or covered up by people who want to change the story later." The words hit me like a successful series of funding announcement, simultaneously validating and terrifying. My 8-year-old daughter had internalized lessons about documentation and evidence preservation that most corporate executives never fully understand, even after decades of managing compliance requirements and regulatory oversight. I helped Daddy build new companies that protect other kids from people like Grandma. We made computer programs that can tell when adults are lying about medicine or trying to hurt children by pretending to help them. It's like having a really smart friend who notices patterns that grown-ups miss because they're too busy with work stuff. She was describing our expansion of Verdict Cloud's AI capabilities and the angel investments in SafeFeed Technologies and Legal Guardian with the casual precision of someone who'd grown up watching me transform personal tragedy into systematic solutions for preventing similar crimes. Kid understood business development better than most venture capital associates. "I'm learning about money and investments so I can help more families when I grow up. Daddy says the trust fund you guys have isn't just for college. It's for building things that matter more than just making rich people richer." The trust fund had grown significantly over the past 2 years, not just from conservative investment strategies, but from Verdict Cloud's continued success in the legal tech market. Our Series B funding had led to a Series C round that valued the company at over $200 million, and my equity position was approaching the kind of generational wealth that could fund entire nonprofit organizations dedicated to preventing systematic child abuse. But more importantly, Kaya was learning to think about financial resources as tools for social impact rather than just personal accumulation. She attended our quarterly board meetings as an observer, asking questions about how our AI algorithms could be applied to protect vulnerable populations and why some investment opportunities aligned with our family's mission while others were just profit maximization disguised as innovation. "I miss you guys every day, but I'm not sad all the time anymore. Dr. Harper says that's normal and healthy. She says some people die because of bad choices other people make, but that doesn't mean the people who love them should stop building good things or helping other families stay safe." We'd continued the intensive therapy sessions with Dr. Harper, flying out to California quarterly for specialized treatment that helped Kaya process survivor guilt and understand her role in preventing future tragedies without carrying inappropriate responsibility for her brother's deaths. The private jet flights had become routine. Not lifestyle signaling, but practical transportation for accessing the best possible care for trauma that most therapists weren't equipped to handle. "Love, your sister who sees everything. P.S. I'm still documenting important stuff, but now it's for helping people instead of trying to figure out why trusted adults do terrible things." She folded the letter and placed it between the headstones with the ceremonial precision of someone filing crucial evidence in a case that would never be closed. Then she stepped back and took my hand again, waiting for whatever came next in our modified family's ongoing operations. We drove home in my Tesla, the same car I'd used for commuting to Verdict Cloud offices when I thought the biggest challenges in my life involved scaling AI algorithms and managing investor expectations. The vehicle hummed with that quiet efficiency that reminded me of promises kept and systems that actually worked as designed, unlike the family safety protocols I'd failed to implement when my children needed protection most. That evening, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Upper West Side penthouse, watching the city transform into its nighttime configuration of lights and possibilities. The view was still spectacular, the kind of real estate asset that appreciates regardless of personal tragedies or family restructuring. But it no longer represented the simple equation of professional success equals personal happiness that had guided my previous decision-making frameworks. I walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet where I used to keep the Macallan 25. The bottle I'd poured down the sink the night after discovering that someone had used pharmaceutical expertise to systematically murder my children. The space was empty now, a deliberate choice that reminded me every day that some victories should never be celebrated and some achievements matter less than the relationships they're supposed to protect. Instead, I filled 2 fingers of water into the crystal glass that used to hold single malt whiskey worth more than most people's monthly salaries. I raised it toward the skyline and said my sons' names out loud: Rowan Marcus Hale, Beck Alexander Hale, transforming their memory into a daily commitment to build something useful from the ashes of systematic family destruction. Tomorrow I had a board meeting with Meridian Ventures about potentially acquiring a small safety tech company that had developed innovative monitoring systems for institutional childcare facilities. We'd review their technology, assess their market position, evaluate whether a friendly acquisition or hostile takeover approach would better serve our strategic objectives for expanding protective capabilities. But tonight, I sat with Kaya at our dining room table and helped her with homework that had nothing to do with pharmaceutical crime or family violence. 3rd grade math problems, reading comprehension exercises, art projects that documented everyday childhood experiences instead of systematic abuse by trusted relatives. I used to think power lived in equity stakes, asset accumulation, and strategic acquisitions that expanded market dominance. Now I understood that real power lives in children brave enough to tell the truth when adults fail to protect them, and in the willingness to build systems that prevent other families from depending on 8-year-old investigators to expose criminal behavior disguised as professional expertise. My job, the only one that mattered anymore, was creating a world where Kaya would never again have to choose between family loyalty and protecting innocent lives. Where children could trust that adults with medical credentials weren't systematically poisoning babies. Where parents could focus on building successful careers without worrying that trusted relatives were conducting pharmaceutical murder experiments in their own kitchens. The view from our penthouse showed 8 million people pursuing their individual definitions of success. But success, I'd learned, wasn't about building unicorn valuations or achieving optimal exit strategies. Success was about protecting the people who mattered most and using whatever resources you'd accumulated to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of systematic destruction that transforms memorial services into crime scenes and turns 6-year-old children into key witnesses in homicide trials. Some lessons cost more than you ever imagined you could afford to pay. But once you've learned them, you have a responsibility to make sure that price wasn't paid in vain.